Buenas tardes. Permítanos un momentito para dirigirles unas palabras y entonces les va a hablar don Miguel Ángel Castañeda, que es el director del Aula de Cultura del diario Montañés.
Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a este Salón de Actos de la Universidad Internacional Menéndez Pelayo, en nombre de la propia universidad y en el del Aula de Cultura del diario Montañés. Como ustedes saben, sobre todo las personas que sean habituales de los martes literarios, esta actividad cultural nació siempre de una colaboración entre la UIMP y el diario Montañés, que para nosotros, para el diario Montañés, ha sido muy satisfactoria y muy fructífera, y que esperamos y confiamos en que tenga larga vida por delante y ya una buena historia y una larga tradición. Únicamente decirles que este va a ser hoy, aquí y ahora, el primer acto de esta recién nacida Aula de Cultura del diario Montañés, que es una iniciativa del periódico para ofrecer eventos culturales en la ciudad de Santander y en la provincia de Cantabria. Tendrán ustedes más información de lo que es el Aula de Cultura en los próximos días en las páginas del diario Montañés. Únicamente, y como fin a mis palabras, reiterar el agradecimiento a la UIMP por el trabajo que realizan y, desde luego, expresar también la satisfacción del diario Montañés por permitirnos esta colaboración y el ofrecer, no solamente a los santanderinos y cántabros, sino a todas aquellas personas que ya en estos meses de verano están aquí con nosotros, ofrecerles estas jornadas de los martes literarios. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, yo también voy a ser muy breve, pero no queríamos que empezara esta cita tan tradicional de los martes literarios, quizá la más tradicional y más antigua que tenemos, sin que yo les diera a ustedes la bienvenida. La bienvenida diciéndoles que la verdad es que hemos dedicado durante todo el año, esto no se hace de un día para otro, la selección de estas personas que con distintos géneros y distintos estilos van a estar con ustedes todos los martes. Pero yo también quería darles las gracias porque están aquí. El año pasado pasaron por los martes literarios más de 3.000 personas. Yo no conozco en Madrid ningún acto cultural que haya superado esto. Por lo tanto, son ustedes estupendos. Nosotros nos esforzamos pues, en traer lo mejor. Este año hemos empezado antes, aprovechando la presencia de Philip Kerr, que espero que hayan leído, y si no lo han leído, léanlo porque es estupendo. Pero a lo largo de todo este verano procuraremos, y vendrán, como muy bien verán ustedes en las actividades, pues lo mejor que hay en estos momentos en el país y lo que más pueda interesar. Gracias por estar aquí y yo creo que nos veremos durante todo el verano. Muchas gracias.
Hola, buenas tardes. Bueno, como ya es tradicional y bueno, ya han explicado, Manuel Ángel Castañeda, el director del Aula de Cultura del diario Montañés, y Maricruz, la vicerrectora de Actividades Culturales de la Universidad Internacional Menéndez Pelayo, damos hoy comienzo, nada menos que con la figura de Philip Kerr, a una nueva edición de un ciclo que lleva ya muchos veranos, muchos años, mucho tiempo siendo un referente cultural de los veranos de la ciudad de Santander, como son los martes literarios, y que, bueno, puesto que este año ha sido, comienzan con un poquito de adelanto sobre otras ediciones, pues seguramente casi todos los que están entre el público, una buena mayoría, juegan en casa y son gente conocida de los ciclos y ya han venido en muchas ocasiones. Darles la bienvenida a este verano de 2012 y a esta edición de los martes literarios. Y bueno, me ha transmitido Guillermo Balbona, que como saben es el otro presentador y que hoy por diversos motivos de trabajo no podía asistir, que les transmita también su saludo, sus disculpas por no haberles podido acompañar en esta primera cita. Y vamos a pasar a, como es tradicional en el formato, para quienes puedan no conocerlo, a hacer una pequeña entrevista, una conversación distendida, agradable, con Philip Kerr acerca de su obra, de su trabajo, de su forma de ver el mundo, la literatura, etc. Y darle sobre todo la bienvenida a los martes literarios y bueno, pues decir que estamos muy honrados de tener a un escritor de su talento, de su talla y entre nosotros. Y bueno, si les parece vamos comenzando. Entonces, bueno, a mí sí que me gustaría iniciar la conversación, la charla, hablando de un aspecto de la escritura de Philip Kerr que tal vez es menos conocido entre los lectores españoles y que son sus ciclos de literatura infantil, ¿no? Es decir, los niños de la lámpara, los niños de la lámpara mágica, ¿no? Es un ciclo de novelas, de historias para niños que muestran una escritura diferente, una forma de ver el mundo quizá un poquito distinta de la que se plantea en la novela policíaca. Entonces, bueno, me gustaría que nos hablara de cómo se encuentra con la literatura infantil, por qué da inicio a estas series, etc.
Well, I've got 3 children of my own, and my eldest son, who's now 19, has never been much of a reader, and I wrote my first children's book really as an attempt to make him a reader. It was kind of blackmail, if you like. I thought if I wrote one children's book and dedicated it to him, that would be one book he would actually have to read that year. And so that's why I started doing it. I always thought writing for children would be really difficult, and that was another reason I hadn't done it before. It seemed that to write for children required the ability to shed sophistication, to stop being an adult. And there were all sorts of things I've discovered about myself because I've written for children since. And one of the things I've discovered, which I've really enjoyed discovering, is that when I write for children, I feel young. It's like being Peter Pan. I get in touch with my inner 12-year-old. I think it's true for all of us adults, that inside we all feel that we're no different from how we were when we were a small child. I certainly feel pretty much exactly as I remember I felt when I was 12. The only difference is that I'm now fatter and greyer and supposedly wiser. But the reality is, as you get older, I think this is one of the things you discover about getting old, is that you don't really feel any different. Your legs may not work as quickly. You might creak a bit when you get up in the morning. But inside, you're no different. So once a year for the last 7 or 8 years, I would write a book for children in this series. And for me, it was a fantastic way of, as I say, becoming a child again. And I can't recommend that highly enough, to find something where you can rediscover your childhood. So I take it very seriously. I don't look at writing for children as in any way an inferior thing to writing for adults. If anything, I take it even more seriously. Not least because I get so many emails from children. And invariably they say, if children write to you, they don't want to tell you how terrible your books are. They never want to point out mistakes. What they really want to tell you is how much they've enjoyed your stuff and how sometimes you've changed their lives. And so the emails I've had from children have been the most important emails and fan letters I've ever had, because it really touches you when you get a child who says something like, I was never a reader. I never was really interested in books, but when I read your books, it changed my life. And now I'm a reader, and I think, fantastic. That's really all I wanted to do, was make, even if I didn't succeed with my own eldest son, at least I've succeeded with somebody else. And children are fantastically straightforward and honest about what they say as well. I got an email last week from a boy in India, and his email went something like this: why do all good things have to end? And his email said, I read all of the Harry Potter books, and then I read the Percy Jackson books, and then I read your books, and I thought no book would be better than Harry Potter or Percy Jackson. And then I read your books, and because they were about two children who are genies, I liked your books better than I liked those ones. But that wasn't what made me interested in his email. It was just the way he said, but the thing is, the really awful thing, he said, you've ended it. This is the last book. And he was writing to me to beg me to write another one. So I had to write back and say, well, you know, the really interesting thing is that sometimes the good things do have to end. And it's only the fact that they have ended sometimes that makes us appreciate how good they were. And I wrote this almost philosophical email about, you know, the seasons, you know, winter, spring, summer, autumn, and how everything had a kind of circularity about it, and all good things ended. Like childhood itself, I said. And so I never get a chance to write this kind of stuff to anyone else but children. So that's why I treasure it as an experience. I wrote 7 of those books, and it was an experience I will always enjoy having had. I'm not sure I could do it again, but I really, really did enjoy it.
Bueno, dentro de esta parte que podemos pensar un poco del lado humano de los escritores, no consiguió que su hijo mayor se aficionara a la lectura, pero sí ha conseguido que todos sus hijos compartan la pasión por el Arsenal, ¿no? Ya que estamos ahora a mitad de la Eurocopa.
They are Arsenal fans.
Yeah.
They are, yeah. My eldest son did read the book. He read it, the first one. He read the first one. And I pointed out that it was dedicated to him. And he said, oh, yeah, not bad, not bad. And I thought, well, thank you very much. I was hoping for a little bit more than this. Anyway, several months passed, and I went to a lunch party with my family. And there was a girl at this lunch party who was about the same age as William. And she was fantastically good looking. I don't mean to sound like Humbert in Lolita, but she was about 14, and she looked just like Britt Ekland. She was staggeringly beautiful. And she said, oh, you wrote this book, Children of the Lamb. I love this book. I love this book. And I could see my son, William, thinking the same. He thought, God, she's good looking. And he went home, and he reread the book immediately. And then he saw the girl again, and guess what? They were talking about my book. And I said to him, I said, well, I could have told you this all along. And I tell children the same story, which is books make you more attractive to the opposite sex. Reading makes you sexy, because any fool can talk about what was on TV last night. But not everyone can talk about an interesting book. And so I think maybe if he'd had more success with the girl, maybe his reading would have improved. But my middle son, on the other hand, who's a real charmer with the ladies, very good-looking boy, he is a keen reader. So I think maybe that's something he and his girlfriend have in common. But yes, we're all, for our sins, we're Arsenal fans. And, of course, our greatest player, Cesc Fabregas, unfortunately was taken away from us by Barcelona. But we don't mind that because he comes from Barcelona, and let's face it, the boy wanted to go home. People keep asking me about my opinions about football now, just because I said yesterday something about how I thought football was a lot more interesting than tennis. I live in Wimbledon, in London, and my house is about 5 minutes from the tennis club, and every year I rent my half of my house to a sports company that covers the Wimbledon tennis, which is one reason I'm here. And I don't envy them, you know, because I used to go to Wimbledon for the tennis. I used to get tickets every day, and I'd go and oh God, after a while it was so boring. Just two huge men hammering a ball at each other, you know, rally, 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 and your head sort of doing this business, and so I stopped going. I just got so bored with watching this. Women's tennis I like. Let me just say this right away. I adore women's tennis because women are so much more interesting to look at than men anyway, in my opinion. Especially the women in tennis, the Maria Sharapovas, and because they're just so, I mean, they have such long legs and they look so healthy. And if they didn't make those silly noises when they hit the ball, I suppose I might enjoy it more. Sharapova seems to have this extraordinary animal squeal when she hits the ball, you know, you know, when she hits the ball. And it's really very off-putting to watch this. At least in football, nobody hears when you scream because everybody else is screaming at the same time. Anyway, so yeah, football. Yeah, better not get started too much. Fortunately, you guys won your group last night. England has the big game tonight, and of course, being England, you know, it just might all go wrong because now we think we've got a chance. Because Wayne Rooney's going to play tonight. There's an amazing picture of Wayne Rooney in El País today, and I've never seen him look more like Shrek than he does in this picture. And I think El País, they must have chosen this picture deliberately because he looks astonishingly like Shrek. Anyway.
Bueno, volvemos un poco a la literatura. Y bueno, quizá una buena pregunta es ¿por qué hoy es tan importante para los lectores la novela negra? Desde hace unos años es quizá uno de los géneros preferidos por los lectores, probablemente el género preferido por los lectores y seguramente por muchos de las personas que nos acompañan entre el público que habrán venido pues un poco atraídos por la propia personalidad de Philip Kerr y de la serie sobre Berlín Noir y sobre Bernie Gunther.
Well, story for a long time became a kind of dirty word in literature. A lot of writers are more interested in writing beautiful sentences and delicate pieces of prose than they are in telling a story. And I think a lot of people got tired of that. In England, it was style and how you wrote was much more fashionable than what you wrote. And I think people need stories. People have a need for a story. And it's almost like we come back to children. There's nothing childish, you see, about liking a good story. But amongst a certain kind of writer, especially in America and England, there is a kind of, I suppose, a contempt for story. It's like, you know, oh, well, you know, that's that kind of writing. It's genre writing. It's story first. And I'm unashamed. I'm utterly story-led. I've always been a story-led writer. Ever since I was a child. I loved telling stories when I was a child. My parents called it lying. And I found it was writing stuff was a more socially acceptable way of lying, I soon discovered, and telling stories. And people want to be entertained. There's so much competing for people's attention now. It always seems to me strange that some writers try and make it really difficult for readers. They go out of their way to be obscure. They, you read the first page of a book and you think, well, was that the first page or was that the end? I don't know. And I have this problem. And so I like to tell a story. I like fine writing too, but I like to sneak my fine writing into my books. I like to if I have a message, I like to sneak that in as well through the back door. Again, I don't set out to have a political message or a religious or a philosophical message. I put telling the story at the top of the list of priorities, because I think once you've taken the trouble to entertain people, then they will listen to you. Then they will tolerate your little bit of message, your little political rant. And I usually have one. It's just hidden somewhere in the book. I get very exercised about sort of like American foreign policy or British foreign policy and how we continue to make the same mistakes that history should have told us that we made before and we shouldn't make again. So I quite often like to remind people, I like to put something in a book that reminds people that this happened before. So it's when you write about something that seems to be historical, but actually it could just as easily be current and topical, then that's something I particularly enjoy doing. And that's something you can only do, I think, if you've taken the trouble to entertain people.
Cuando estuvo en Barcelona para recoger el premio de novela negra de RBA Editores, comentó que cuando se está mucho tiempo rodeado de nazis, uno necesita darse una ducha, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, de alguna manera me parece curioso porque lleva muchos años, gracias o alrededor de la serie de Berlín y de Gunther, rodeado de nazis, ¿no? ¿Cómo se consigue sobrevivir o por qué ir a buscar precisamente un investigador, primero policía, luego detective, que vive en el ascenso de Hitler y de los nazis y que luego se pasa la vida recorriendo todos los grandes momentos de los nazis escondidos en Argentina, conexiones con Cuba, etcétera, ¿no?
Well, I get asked this question a lot, especially in Germany. Isn't it time to draw a line under the whole thing? Isn't it time to forget about this? And actually, I don't think it is at all. If anything, current affairs, recent events in politics should actually make us think about these things even more than we used to. I was in Berlin last year, or yes, I think it was last year, last spring, and I walked past the old Air Ministry. It was about midnight. It's now the Ministry of Finance. But at night, of course, it could still look exactly like the old Luftwaffe headquarters. It's incredibly atmospheric, sort of part of Berlin. And I looked up, and the lights were all burning on the top floor. And for 1 minute, you could tell yourself, yes, must have been like that when Hermann Goering and the Luftwaffe were in there, and they were planning, the invasion of Great Britain. And then I took a step back into the present day, which often happens to me in Berlin. I walk around Berlin, and it's easy to sort of look at ghosts, look at buildings, and see things that used to be that aren't there anymore. And this was a moment when I had been looking at the ghost of a building, and then suddenly present day came up and sort of almost smacked me in the face. And I realized the Ministry of Finance were working out how much money probably how much money they were going to give for the Greek bailout. And I thought, history is a fantastically exciting thing when you look at it in these terms. When you look at sort of Germany, how since 1870 it has sought to dominate Europe politically and militarily in the case of the Kaiser and in Hitler's case. And now, of course, that they do dominate Europe. They do dominate Europe in financial, economic terms. They don't actually want to dominate Europe. And so it must seem so strange that to be German and to have this position and to be faced with the reality of being the dominant power in Europe after all, and then suddenly thinking, well, actually, maybe it's not such a good thing. So why I write about it, well, obviously, it's the most important historical event, the Second World War and the Nazi Revolution. It's the most important historical event since the Reformation, which, interestingly, was also started by a German. It was started by a German called Martin Luther. Martin Luther was greatly admired by Hitler. There are several chapters of Mein Kampf which are devoted to Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a pretty awful man in a lot of ways. He was an anti-Semite. He believed he'd been spared death by God for some great mission. And interestingly, these are the things that Hitler himself thought were important, because those are the things that had happened to Hitler himself. So Hitler really identified with Martin Luther. But I think the reason why everybody feels a certain fascination with this period of history is because it's possibly the only time in the last 70 years that a war has been fought where it's very clear who was on the side of good and who was on the side of evil. Of course, I'm British, so we were on the side of good, obviously. No war that has been fought since has it been possible to say these people, the British, the Americans, the Spanish, other NATO allies, were on the side of good. I don't think. Because what's been done in places like Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq, I don't think any of it has had any obvious moral significance. But the Second World War does, for all the obvious reasons that it seems pointless to go into now. But it's clear cut. Not only, the Nazis look evil as well, because they wear black uniforms with skulls and crossbones on them and stuff like that. So it's kind of very easy. Having said all that, the British have been terribly good at occupying moral high ground on this subject for a long time. And I think, if anything, the 21st century gives us historical perspective to look at the Holocaust and to put it in the context of other terrible things that were done by men to other men. Whether it was the Spanish in the South America, whether it was the Belgians in the Congo, whether it was the Russians massacring an entire class of people called the kulaks. And then my own people, because we think, the Brits think we've never done anything wrong. The empire in India was a benign, good thing. Well, after the Indian Mutiny, which was a freedom fight by the Indians, let's face it, the British behaved in India like the SS, frankly. They massacred 50,000, 60,000 people as revenge. And what we did in Australia, massacring Aborigines, was equally bad. And we even invented the concentration camp in South Africa. So I think if we're really honest, if the Brits are really honest, then we have to say, we've done some terrible things too. And so I make a point whichever country I'm in now, I point out that it's almost a corollary of great civilization, that there should have been some barbaric act attaching to that civilization. So obviously when I'm in America, I mention the massacre, the genocide of the American Indian, the Native American Indian, when more than 1 million American Indians were murdered, which was way higher than almost any other people. So, but I do feel I need to take a shower at the end of a book, because if you've spent time in the company of someone like Reinhard Heydrich, then you do feel, because you see, you have to make these people human. In order to write about them effectively, you have to get in touch with them as human beings. You have to find their humanity to bring them alive. And I don't think this kind of diminishes their evil in any way, shape or form. If anything, I think it makes it kind of worse. But what I don't like is when we talk about these people as monsters, as animals and things like that, because actually that lets us all off the hook as human beings. It means that we think there are some people who are just barbaric and animals, and when in fact the reality is that it is so typical of the human species to murder large quantities of other human species. And I give you a very good little picture of this in the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey. Kubrick understands this moment absolutely, because he gives the monolith lands on the planet, and the apes who've lived in a kind of sort of Edenic innocence see the monolith, and then one of the apes called Moonwatcher touches the monolith, and it doesn't sort of affect him in any other way except to become a fascist, because the first thing he does was he makes a tool, but the first tool he makes is a weapon. And with the first weapon, he smashes in the head of another ape. And I think it was a profound moment in cinema, because it illustrates a deep, profound understanding of what man is like. And you can see it all the way through Kubrick's other films too, like Paths of Glory, when the French army has to make an example of 3 completely innocent soldiers. And they shoot them for nothing. But 3 people have to be shot, and so these people are going to be shot. And I think he had a real understanding of man's inhumanity to man. So, sorry, a very long answer to a perfectly short, reasonable question. Sorry.
Una respuesta estupenda. Y bueno, un poco en la línea de algunas de las valoraciones que ha hecho en esta explicación, ¿no? A mí me sorprende o me llama la atención que el personaje de Bernie Gunther es un personaje que, por un lado, rechaza o no tiene buenas relaciones, buenas sensaciones ante esos poderes totalitarios con los que se encuentra la Alemania nazi, pero que al mismo tiempo tampoco parece condenado de alguna manera a mantener relaciones con ellos, y posteriormente también con Perón en Argentina, con la Cuba de Batista. Es decir, que parece que está perseguido por regímenes cuando menos totalitarios, ¿no? Y a tener algunos tipos de tensiones, lo mismo que también con la CIA o con los servicios secretos soviéticos, ¿no? Parece que le gusta estar cerca del lado oscuro, ¿no? O que no puede evitarlo.
Well, the interesting thing about writing about a character like this is you have to make him a hero. He has to be the hero. But if he's going to be an interesting hero, he has to do things that aren't heroic. He has to do things sometimes that are mean-spirited, cowardly. He has to be cynical. I distrust heroes who always behave like a hero. I mean, the whole concept of a hero starts in classical literature with Achilles. So if you like, Achilles is the first hero in literature, but he's also a complete psychopath and a complete bastard. He is moody, he's rude, he stays in his tent, he doesn't come out and speak, and whenever he does come out, he just kills huge numbers of people. And yet, he's still our first example of a hero. And I think if we look through literature, the interesting heroes do have flaws. So I wanted always to have a hero who was flawed, because it seemed to me then he would enable me to understand something. And because behind all of these books I've written over the years has been a need to understand why what happened did happen. And originally I didn't set out to write a book about a detective. I wanted to write about Berlin. I wanted to write about what it was like to be an ordinary German who was living against a background where the whole country had been hijacked by the Nazis. And because Berlin is one of those curious places where things have changed and changed so many times, I mean, for example, a street name could have had 5 different names over the course of the last 140 years. And it began to seem like I was becoming a detective myself in order to find out things. When I first started writing about this, you see, there was very little information available. There were very few books published about it, about the period. And now it seems like there's a new book about whether it's Heydrich or a book about the American ambassador in Berlin. There's one published every week. And I look at these books now and I think, oh God, I wish I'd had that book, 25 years ago. As I say, I decided that I wanted to write about someone who was having to live under the Nazis, but it would have been silly to have chosen, say, a dentist, because a dentist would not be confronted with difficult choices. So it had to be someone who was at the sharp end of Nazism, and that really meant a policeman, a detective. The other interesting thing, you see, which is a little-known fact, is that the Nazis themselves were quite keen on crime writing. Goering was a big fan of Dashiell Hammett. Red Harvest was one of his favorite books. And Heydrich himself, who became the head of the SD, the security service of the SS, had only got the job because he'd been sacked from the German Navy in about 1926, I think, 28, thereabouts. And his wife, Lena, who was a real dyed-in-the-wool Nazi, much more so than Heydrich at the time, she said, well, look, I've got a friend who knows this man called Himmler, and he's looking for someone, you should go and have an interview with him. So she set up this interview with Himmler. And Himmler thought Heydrich had been an intelligence officer in the Navy, and he hadn't been an intelligence officer at all. But during the course of the interview, Heydrich realized he was being asked all these questions about police and crime and intelligence, and fell back on his own reading. And he'd read a lot of spy novels and detective novels and crime novels. And so he just gave back to Himmler stuff that he'd picked up from writers like me, if you like. So that always amused me. So that when I came to write about Heydrich quite recently, it almost seemed like I was sort of closing a circle.
Sí. En un personaje que tiene ya una trayectoria literaria tan amplia, ¿qué parte de Bernie Gunther era el plan original? ¿Era el personaje que había preparado, que había concebido para la primera novela, para Violetas de Marzo? ¿Y en qué parte el propio personaje va creciendo, tomando decisiones o cambiando a lo largo de los libros de la serie hasta Praga Mortal?
Well, when I wrote the first book in 1987, I think. And back in those days, all I really cared about was that I could finally get a book published. And then my agent and my publisher said, well, you know, you should do another one because you've done all this work. And so 1 became 2, and then 2 became 3. And then I said to myself, well, you know what? I didn't come into publishing just to write this one thing, and I should write other things too. So I thought, well, I'll have a break. I'll write some other stuff for a while. And I did, and some of them, well, books are like children, you see. Some are very, some go into the world and lead very successful lives and are liked by people. And then other books, like other children, go into the world and don't do quite as well. They don't make as many friends. And yet, with each book I write, I sort of think of them as precious to me. But you have to recognize that some aren't loved like others. Anyway, that's just kind of one way of explaining why after 15 years, I'd been on many a book tour and I'd written many another book, and people would say, when are you going to write another Bernie Gunther novel? And I thought, after 15 years, I thought, well, you know what, I better do it while people still ask, because maybe they'll stop one day. And then I was telling myself, well, you know, it's interesting. I can write about this character who's older than he was, fatter. He doesn't get the girl quite as often as he used to. A bit like me, really, I thought. You see, when I was starting, he was a much more muscular character, and so was I. And coming back to the subject later on, I realized I was going to have to change, and I was going to have to grow him in a different way. I was going to have to make him a more thoughtful character as he got older. I mean, there's a good example in a book I wrote, which is set in Cuba, which is called, in English, it's called If the Dead Rise Not. I can't remember the Spanish title. But in the book, or maybe, sorry, actually it's the one in Argentina, sorry, it's called The Quiet Flame. And there's a girl who he meets in a bar, and she says she wants him to help look for her parents who disappeared. And she's very attractive, obviously. And Bernie sort of thinks, yeah, she's sexy. And she doesn't have any money. And he wonders what's in it for him. And then she sort of says, well, you know, maybe we could be friends. Maybe we could go to the theater together or something like that. And I liked doing that. I liked doing that sort of thing to him, so that he wasn't like, it's always a cliche when, you know, he obviously gets the girl. Mostly as he gets older, the women who he has relationships with either are doing it out of pity, or they're doing it because they have an ulterior motive. So that's one of the ways he's grown. I was encouraged, you see, by John le Carré, who wrote the fantastic, for my money, he's the best writer in English since, you know, alive today. And I think The Spy Who Came In From the Cold is probably the great post-war novel. It will sum up the Cold War in a way no other book ever will. But it was interesting the way he grew the character of Smiley, who appears as an almost hidden figure in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. He's not in it very much at all. And then by the end of these books, like Smiley's People, he becomes a much more heroic character in the sense that he is the hero of the story. And yet, he is a man who has none of his his colleagues take him seriously. He's been passed over for promotion. His wife is having an affair with somebody else. And in every sense, he's set up to fail. And the genius of the story, of course, is that Smiley is very clever, very thoughtful, and he succeeds against all of the odds. And that was one of the reasons I thought, well, I can create a character who's not as good as Smiley, in my opinion, but who grows as a human being. I think that was really what I was inspired by, the example of him growing as a human being.
Sí. Bueno, un poco está claro que a la hora de preparar las novelas tiene toda un trabajo de documentación, de preparación para recrear los ambientes, de información de acontecimientos políticos, sociales, etc. Y bueno, me parece interesante porque además también lo cuenta en su página web, ¿no? Un poco cómo es el día a día, la vida cotidiana de un escritor a tiempo completo, como lo denomina usted en la web, ¿no?
My daily life is really boring. I lead a life of spectacular, I suppose, well, just nothing happening, really, because my wife doesn't ask me these questions now. She used to, but now that she's writing novels herself, she knows better than to ask me. She used to say, what kind of day did you have? What did you do? And if you're a writer, it's not a question you can ever answer, because generally, it takes about 10 seconds to say what you did. You sat at your desk and you wrote. And I do that religiously every day. It's difficult to explain that everything you've done that's been interesting has happened inside your own head. I mean, if I was to describe it in another way, I could say, well, yeah, I murdered someone in a really interesting way today. Because actually when you're writing it, it kind of feels like you're living it as well. This is the curious schizophrenia about being a writer. If you're into your writing enough, then it starts to feel like the real thing. And I've been talking about this at the university for the past couple of days, and it does interest me, the difference between the writer who has to stay home and write the books and the author who is the person who comes on trips like this and has to behave in a completely different way. It's the difference between the introvert and the extrovert. My natural condition is to be silent and misanthropic and not to smile and to be antisocial and not to answer the telephone and not to answer the doorbell. Or if I do answer the doorbell, I get very cross that I've been disturbed, and the poor window cleaner apparently is now terrified of me, according to my wife. So, but the person who comes here has to be, I have to be like Tony Blair. I have to smile and have a little twinkle in my eye, and I shake everyone's hand and say, "How it's nice to meet you." Yeah, it's almost like you have to, you're after someone's vote. You know, vote for me, I'm Tony Blair, hi. So you have to remind yourself to smile. My wife is always saying, the last thing she says as I leave the house is, smile. And she says, you've got a nice smile, but you never, so I have to remind myself to smile when I come on a book tour, because it doesn't come naturally. See, this is why I don't have any wrinkles on my face. I don't have any wrinkles on my face. It's not because I have Botox or anything. It's because there are no expressions on my face. From one end of the day to the other, there are no expressions. I don't frown very well. I frown a bit, but I don't smile. I don't look worried or anything, because everything is happening in the head. It's not happening on the face. So the research it's funny stuff, research. You have to tell yourself you have to do enough, but you mustn't do too much. You have to allow yourself to recognize the moment when the most important thing of all can happen, which is what your imagination does with it. If I can talk about cricket instead of football for a moment, it's a game I assume that people in Spain know very little about. But the thing about cricket, you see, which makes it interesting, is that a ball can have so much character, and it's the spin that you put on a cricket ball that makes the game interesting. And it's exactly the same with research. It's the spin that your imagination puts on facts that you've learned that makes it interesting. It's not the research itself. You see, research gets used by people who do interviews with newspapers. They think research gives credence, gives some validity to what you've done. It's almost like you've based it on real things. Well, you have to a certain extent, but it's a little bit of a cheat, because actually the most important part of the whole thing has just been that you've made it up. It's your imagination. It's not meant to be a real piece of history. And some people find that very hard to deal with. That when you say, well, you know, I made it up, actually. And they look sort of slightly cheated. I have a good friend, Sebastian Faulks, who wrote a very good novel called Birdsong, which is about the First World War. And whenever he went on a book tour, people assumed that he was over 100 years old until they saw him. Or that he'd discovered some cache of letters from his grandfather or something in the First World War, and the whole book had been based on something real. And so it's a thing when all authors, we all look a bit sort of shifty and a bit sort of sheepish when we actually have to confess, yeah, actually, you know what? I made it up. I made it up. And this, I think, should encourage people, because what it should remind us all of is the power of the human imagination. And if it works well, it should seem real, and it should seem like it's been based on something that really happened. But ultimately, it's about the power of one human mind to convince another human mind that what you're reading actually is real and actually took place.
Sí. Cuando concibe una novela, una historia, la concibe también en un idioma concreto, en inglés, ¿no? Y cuando de alguna manera su obra empieza a extenderse por todo el mundo, pues también sufre un poco las transformaciones propias de las traducciones, ¿no? Es decir, no tiene algo de miedo, de recelo, como les pasa a algunos escritores, de que las historias puedan cambiar, puedan modificarse, puedan perder parte de su espíritu al entrar en otros idiomas que tienen otros códigos de funcionamiento.
Well, the first thing you have to remind yourself when you go on a book tour is that, well, you've generally forgotten half of the things that are in the book you're promoting, because you probably wrote this book 2 or 3 years ago. By the time the book has been translated, you've maybe written 2 more books since then. In my case, you see, that's quite likely. I write a lot because I'm a very compulsive sort of writer. I do it every day, and I enjoy doing it, and I can't imagine doing anything else. As far as the translation is concerned, well, you have to, this is why you have a good publisher. You trust that they will hire good people, and then you will speak to other people and they say, yes, it's a good translation. So I'm lucky. I've got a very good publisher. I've got a very good Catalonian publisher and a very good Spanish publisher. So, but it doesn't always work as well as that. I have my Italian publisher isn't as, the translation isn't as good, but over the years I've come to love these people as like family. And so I think it's more important almost that I remain sort of friends with them rather than that I worry about it being the best translation. And I always have such a good time when I do an Italian book tour that I sort of can't bring myself to sort of think in more commercial terms and say, well, actually, you know, I should pick a more efficient publisher that do a better job. As I say, it's like having a family, and I've always had, a real. Well, I'll give you I'll tell you a story which is quite funny. My Italian publisher, is a senator, and he used to be a member of Mr. Prodi's government. And the first time I ever met him, I came down the stairs of the aircraft, and there was a government limo parked at the bottom of the steps with a little Italian flag. And there was my publisher waiting by the car. And I said, well, it's so kind of you to meet me in a car like this, you know. And I said, this is a first for me. I've never had an official car. And he said, in a wonderfully Italian way, he said, well, Philip, you know, I didn't have anything else to do. The government, it fell half an hour ago. So, and from then on, it was just one wonderful thing after another. I mean, he and I, the next day we had dinner at lunch in the Italian Senate building in the center of Rome. And on our way out, it must have been, well, we had a flight to catch at 3 o'clock to Milan. And we were already pretty tight. It was I think it was about 2 o'clock when finally we left lunch. And on the way out, my publisher saw Mr. Prodi. So they stood there for about 10 or 15 minutes and talked about, you know, the government and Berlusconi, who they both, you know, obviously didn't like. And I kept sort of, you know, finally I was, you know, we ought to go, you know. And he looked at his watch, he said, oh, yes, you're right, we are going to miss the plane. So we got into the car, and I said, you know, we really are going to miss the plane. And he said, yes, you're right. So he got his mobile phone out, and he called the director of the airline, and he said, I'm on my way to the airport, can you hold the plane? So we got to the airport, and there were all these people sitting on the plane waiting, and God, did they look angry, you know, as the official car drove up and we got off and got into the plane. But that's the beauty and charm of doing a book tour in Italy. I mean, you know, you think this is fantastic, you know, and you contrast that with doing a book tour in another country, America, you know, where everything is like efficient and it's all like clockwork and everything. So each country, I mean, I hate to sound, you know, like I'm making stereotypes about this, but I mean, they do kind of work. I mean, I do a book tour in France, for instance, in Paris, and the first thing we used to do was go and have lunch in a Paris restaurant, and it was, you know, and it's still one of the only publishing left, virtually, apart from London, where, you know, you will actually drink a whole bottle of red wine at lunch. In virtually no other publishing situation left does this happen. So I'm not scared of. I'm translated into. Well, I say I am. I mean, my children's books are translated into 42 languages, and I think Bernie Gunther's in like 37 languages. But there are still places I won't go. I sort of think, well, I don't know if I'm up to doing a book tour of this particular place. Each book tour presents different hazards and challenges. That's usually the nice way of describing it. I don't think I'm not difficult to deal with, I don't think. And there are many authors who are worse than me. I shan't name who this person is, but when I went to Finland, I got off the plane and my publishers were there, and it was a nice husband and wife couple, and they had It was a simple old battered Saab motor car, and all the books were in the back. And they looked slightly bewildered. And I said, so what's wrong, guys? And they said, well, we just had Miss X, who had been on this book tour. And I said, oh, well, that looks as though it must have been difficult. And they nodded, and they said, well, when we picked her up at the airport, she took one look at our car and wouldn't get in it. Because she said she only would ride in a limousine, you see. So they sort of, apparently they thought, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? This is Helsinki. There are not many limousines around. This is quite a long time ago, I may say. But finally, the guy thought, I know, I'll phone a funeral company. So he rang a funeral company, and they sent a limousine immediately, because there happened to be one on the way back from a funeral that was empty. So they picked up this lady author, and she stood there for a whole hour at the airport waiting for her funeral car to turn up. So it's best to try and be a little aware of local conditions, I think. Sorry.
Bueno, yo para terminar y dejar ya también una parte al público, ¿qué le gusta leer a Philip Kerr? Porque todo escritor es por necesidad un buen lector, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué le gusta leer?
Well, I read a lot, not as much as I used to. I read mainly histories and biographies. I'm reading a very good book at the moment, which I recommended today to some people. They look slightly bewildered by it, but I'll recommend it to you because I think it's an astonishing book. It's called Family of Secrets. Sounds good. It's by an author called Russ Baker. It's an American book. And it's about the Bush family. It's about Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. And when I was in America quite recently, I was watching TV and Gore Vidal was on. And someone said to him the same question, what are you reading, Gore? And he said, I am reading the most extraordinary book about the most criminal family this country has ever produced. And he cited this book, and I thought, well, which family is it? And then he mentioned it was the Bush family. And it's full of fantastic stuff. You couldn't believe some of the stuff that's in this book. So I don't know if it's translated into Spanish. I thoroughly recommend it because it is one of the most eye-opening books I think you'll ever read. And it's not so much the sexual stuff. I mean, there's a little bit of that. It's mainly the sort of, well, it's like stuff like, why did George Bush Sr. feel the need to establish an alibi for where he was on November the 22nd, 1963? Which he did. He went to enormous lengths to create an alibi for himself that proved he wasn't in Dallas, Texas. And so there's a whole chapter with copious amounts of detail like this. So I was a big Watergate fan. I loved all the books that came out at the time, you know, the John Dean Blind Ambition and, you know, stuff like that. All the President's Men. And here's another thing that's in the book. Apparently, I mean, I think this is true. From the amount of information this guy has got, it must be true. Bob Woodward was in the CIA, which goes against everything you think was... what was going on? What was going on? Bob Woodward was in the CIA. So he was in naval military intelligence before he became a journalist. He got a job in journalism courtesy of Al Haig, who was, again, in military intelligence. Al Haig phoned up someone and said, look, you know, I've got this friend who needs a job. And you know, this book is just remarkable. It really is. So I hope I can make this guy a bestseller, because Gore's doing his best to talk up the story. So I'm doing my best as well, actually. I don't read many novels, actually. I don't read many novels because I tend to read history, as I say.
Sí. Bueno, yo creo que seguramente haya muchas preguntas interesantes entre el público, así que si le parece bien, les cedemos la palabra para ver. ¿Alguna pregunta? Sí, tenemos... Sí. ¿El micro, por favor? Ah, sí.
I have a good friend who's called Barbara Vine, Ruth Rendell, who's also called Barbara Vine. And she, I did an event with her and she said, interesting questions only. And then the poor man who'd put his hand up first, she looked at him and she said, that's not an interesting question. Next.
Okay. Well, I hope I don't sound like that character in Hitchcock's movie. He said, how do you cure pips when poultry? But my question would be a technical question. When you're dealing with children's literature, and I imagine you mean like 12 years old and up, like, how do you feel about restrictions on yourself or limiting yourself in terms of word choice and this very interesting concept you have of story? Do you have to think about making a story, limiting a story for the level of sophistication you think you're dealing with?
Well, I think of myself as a little, this sounds really pretentious, I'm sorry, but when I first started writing for children, I thought I would have to shed a level of sophistication in order to write for them. And I didn't think of that as like lowering my sights. On the contrary, I actually thought of it as lifting them. To doing away with sophistication seemed to me to be a more difficult thing. And it seemed very like what Matisse did when he became an abstract painter. You knew Matisse could paint or draw perfectly, just like Picasso. But the point was that in order to find a simplicity, he had to stop being a sophisticated, urbane artist and find the child, which is a high challenge, I think. As for the story, what's interesting is that there is a level of political correctness which exists in American publishing, which you have to which you come up against. I mean, for instance, my kids in the story, because they were genies, in the beginning they were fascinated with smoke, and the woman who was their housekeeper, stroke nanny, was a smoker, and she would like put a cigarette down in an ashtray, and then they'd watch the kids would watch the little trail of smoke, and it was awakening something in them because they were genies. It was awakening a desire to become smoke themselves. You see, so in the beginning they misinterpreted it, so they smoked the cigarette. You see, and we had a lot of arguments about this because smoking in America now is like it's like being a child molester. So to have a book for children where the children actually smoked in the first chapter we couldn't do that. So we had to argue about that. There was another instance where this happened. There was a scene where a child was in a coma, and because she was a genie, the only way to get her out of the coma was if a special kind of bee was brought from a special kind of apiary. And one of the heroes of the story, who's called Nimrod, held the bee in a special pair of golden tweezers and would flick the bee and then put it on her bottom, and it would sting her on her bare bottom, you see. And again, you know, bare bottoms in children's books, well, we couldn't have that either. And you think, oh, come on, guys, look, if you're a child, there is no funnier place to get stung than in your arse. So we couldn't have people being stung in the bottom either, you know. So you do come up against this kind of political correctness, I think. Kids, you see, they can't see anything wrong with that. really. And why should they? There's nothing wrong with it, you know.
Sí, tenemos... Sí, tenemos ahí otra.
Okay.
En el mismo sentido de la pregunta anterior, quería saber un poco sobre un escritor cuando lo hace, se fija también en cuidarse en reproducción de estereotipos, de, por ejemplo, temas de género, etnia.
Well, the character I write about holds some fairly politically incorrect views. He's quite sexist. He smokes a lot of cigarettes, and he holds stereotypical views about the French or the English or Americans. I don't mind, actually. It doesn't bother me. I mean, if people want to have stereotypes about... You see, I'm from Scotland. Now, people have lots of stereotypes about the Scots, and it bugs the Scots an awful lot. And I think it really bugs them because nearly all of the stereotypes are true. So I can honestly say that the stereotype about the Scot, which is they drink too much, they smoke too much, they don't get much exercise, no one can understand what they say, these are all true. They all die far too young. They eat a terrible diet. Again, these are all stereotypes that are true. So I think if you start out from that position, that you recognize your own stereotype and what it is. The Scots are also mean. They don't like spending money. These are true things as well, you see. So I'm very happy to own up to a stereotype, and I just assume other people ought to be a bit more relaxed about the stereotypes too, and not get upset about it. People get upset about absurd things, really. And, so if someone says to me, oh, you're a Scot, aren't you? You're all a bunch of mean, people who drink too much. Well, I say, yes, you're absolutely right. And your football teams are rubbish. Yes, they are. They're terrible. They're the worst football teams now, almost anywhere. Scottish football is in a lamentable state. So I think instead of getting upset about stereotypes, we should embrace them and enjoy them a bit, really. I think the trouble is, because we live in an increasingly homogenous Europe, when everybody is supposed to be not Spanish, not British, not French, they're supposed to be European, whatever that is. I don't know. I mean, it seemed to me that one of the great things about coming to Europe was buying your pesetas and going to the bullfight. I mean, that's a stereotype, isn't it? Going to the bullfight. That's what British... I mean, I went to my first bullfight in 1968. And I've been to many since and have thoroughly enjoyed them all. So is that a stereotype? I don't know. When I go to Germany, I eat lots of sausage and drink lots of beer, and I like that too. And, is that a stereotype? I don't know. We should celebrate our differences, not try and be all the same. The terrible thing, I think, is you go to a country and you see Benetton and you see Starbucks and you see McDonald's and you think, oh, well, I could be back home. Isn't it horrible? I don't want to see Benetton and Starbucks. And when I come here, I walked down to the port the other day and it's fantastic. It feels like somewhere different, and I want that to continue. I don't want it all to be the same. And there's this awful plot, I think, just to make us all the same so that we can be controlled by a bunch of lawyers. Sorry. And can I have your vote?
Creo que sí.
Le iba a hacer una pregunta. Siendo un escritor tan prolífico, ¿no le han propuesto llevar alguna de sus novelas al cine?
Oh, many times. I've sold lots and lots of. I'm not prolific, I think, as incontinent. I don't know when to stop. I'm driven. You see, this is again part of the Scottish stereotype, is the Scottish Protestant work ethic. It's to be driven. It's to be desperate to prove something, to succeed. I don't know why, but I feel this. But over the years, for the last 20 years, I've had a love-hate relationship with Hollywood, and I've sold lots and lots of stuff to lots and lots of movie stars, and I've hung out with movie stars, and it's been great. You know, it's been fun, but nothing has been made, and I think. Actually, sometimes I think that's quite a good thing, that I've been paid very handsomely, but nothing's been made. So I don't have to sit through a film of a book I've written with next to, as has happened to friends of mine, and they've sat through films that they've absolutely hated, and then had to come out, and of course the press are there immediately. You know, what did you think of it? And they know it's a terrible film. So the poor author then has to say, well, it was a great film, you know, and because he doesn't want to upset the people who bought it. So I've been lucky. I've been very lucky. I've worked with lots and lots of great movie stars, and we've had great times. And I never make the mistake of assuming they were my friends. It was just a kind of relationship that existed for a while. And I mean, I'm one of the few people who's been kissed on the lips by Robert De Niro. So, few guys, I think, you know. That was a shock, actually, when that happened, because I wasn't expecting it. I assume it was an Italian thing, you know, a kind of mafia thing. But even my wife was slightly taken aback when it happened. Having said that, Bob is, you know, he's utterly heterosexual. I know that for a fact. But that was just a little bit of a surprise. But that's one of the great things about going to Hollywood. It's like, you know, these things happen. I could write a whole book about stuff that's happened to me in Hollywood. But because we're being filmed, I don't think I'll mention too many of the stories right now. Well, I think that's a lot, isn't it? Right. Yeah.
Sí. Bueno, pues como parece que no hay más preguntas, vamos a ir terminando. Bueno, pues sobre todo dando las gracias a Philip Kerr, porque creo que ha sido pues un espléndido inicio de los martes literarios de este año, y que promete que también tendremos nuevos martes interesantes. Entonces aprovecho para recordarles que el próximo martes tendremos en esta misma tribuna a Almudena Grandes, y que como siempre están invitados. Muchas gracias y hasta el martes que viene.